Humans have great thinking capabilities, which makes us more advanced as time goes on. We develop many helpful items and also ideologies which we still uphold up to this day. Humans may be part of many types of species on this planet, but it is for certain that the things we have done caused a great impact. We pioneered many beneficial things, but unfortunately, some of our actions that we caused took a toll on Flora. Flora, our dear friend, which was undoubtedly the most precious thing on this planet, the one who gives us air to breathe, is now scarred. Human activities disrupted the nitrogen and sulfur cycle, which caused both short-term and long-term effects on our lives. The day we hurt Flora was the day that changed the trajectory of our lives.
How we humans dependent to flora? Or shall I say, how we humans dependent to plants? Well, plants play a very important role to all living organisms. Plants provide oxygen and food to all living creatures. And besides giving oxygen, plants also use to create medicine. Those herbal medicines and those are in tablets. All the mixtures, the ingredients, mostly came from the plants. And what amazes me is that in today's time, the pandemic, plants went viral in a way that more people are becoming interested in collecting them. And shall we call them plantita or plantito? Many of them collecting various types of plants for ornaments and decorations for their front yards, backyards, even inside their house. And I think that we are very much dependent to plants, and we treat plants as a friend and as a helpful being.
The importance of nitrogen cycle. Plants rely on nitrogen, and plants rely on animals. Obviously, nitrogen is necessary for the synthesis of plant and animal protein. Plants, unlike bacteria, cannot directly absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere. Nitrogen is required for plant growth because it provides the energy for plants to grow and produce fruit or vegetables. Nitrogen is a component of the chlorophyll molecule, which gives plants their green color and is involved in the plant's food. Involved in the plant's food production. Being alive or human can also connect us to the nitrogen cycle because we eat food that contains proteins. They are composed of amino acids, each of which has at least one nitrogen atom. That nitrogen will have come from nitrogen-containing chemicals in the soil where the plants grew. Lastly, when we die as the living organisms, our bodies are eventually broken down to silver nitrogen compounds. The nitrifying bacteria will eventually recycle those compounds into nitrogen gas.
Proteins and vitamins contain sulfur as one of the components. Proteins are made of sulfur-containing amino acids. Sulfur is required for the proper functioning of protein and enzymes in plants and animals that rely on plants for their sulfur supply. When sulfur is dissolved in water, plants absorb it. Animals consume these plants for them to have enough sulfur to stay healthy. Approximately 80% of the Earth's sulfur is locked up in rocks and salts, and the other 20% is buried deep with marine sediments. As well as being present in the atmosphere, sulfur is also present. There are two ways it enters the atmosphere, naturally and through human activity. Among the natural resources available are volcanic eruptions, bacterial movements, evaporation from water, and decomposing organisms, to name a few examples. In the case of sulfur entering the atmosphere due to human activity, it is primarily due to the industrial activities that generate large quantities of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide gases. When it reaches the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide reacts with oxygen to form sulfur dioxide gas or other chemicals in the atmosphere to produce sulfur salts. These particles will either fall back to Earth or react with rain and fall as acid deposits. Plants will then absorb the particles which will be released back into the atmosphere, restarting the sulfur cycle.
Le Chatelier's principle states that if a dynamic equilibrium is disturbed by changing the conditions, the position of the equilibrium shifts to counteract the change to re-establish an equilibrium. If a chemical reaction is at an equilibrium and experiences a change in pressure, temperature, or concentration of products or reactants, the equilibrium shifts into the opposite direction to the offset of change. One example of this equilibrium is found in the environmental science is the contribution of the carbon cycle as a buffer to minimize the impacts of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere and global temperatures. Because of the role of the CO2 in the climate, feedbacks on carbon cycle act to maintain global temperatures within certain bounds so that the climate never gets too hot or too cold to support life on Earth. But because of the increased rate of outgassing due to human activity, increase of gaseous gases will be trapped in the atmosphere and the wave of energy that is in the atmosphere will convert into heat energy. Unfortunately, the changing climate increases stressors that weaken plant resilience to heat, disrupting forest structure and ecosystem services. Rising temperatures lead to more frequent drought, wildfires, and invasive species outbreaks, leading to loss of plant species that has numerous detrimental effects.
Any living thing that is not native to an ecosystem and causes harm is considered an invasive species. They are those that grow, reproduce swiftly, and spread aggressively. They can have negative consequences for the economy and have the potential to threaten the environment, especially flora. Humans are not invasive species, yet we do cause significant environmental damage because our habits, behavior, and decisions have an effect on it. We contaminate water with waste and toxins that endanger aquatic life, include those invasive species with no natural predators, and use hazardous pesticide with unintended consequences farther up the food chain. When you think about it, all the suffering caused by invasive species are combined faults. Some kind of human activities resulted for those invasive species to be brought in a new location where they can cause harm. There may be no natural predators or control when a new invasive species is introduced into a new environment, and that environment may lack the ability to defend themselves against the intruders, or they may be unable to compete with the predatorless species. By eliminating or replacing native food sources, invasive species can alter the food web of an environment, and invasive species can also affect the diversity and numbers of species that provide crucial habitat for the native wildlife.
Plants undergo various epigenetic changes during their lives which have a direct impact on gene expression in the current and subsequent generations. In the last 20 years, plants' epigenetic and epigenomics have progressed substantially in terms of resources and technology, and scientists now have access to an unbelievable amount of data. The final hurdle is to put this information into a biological context, and maize is an excellent system for doing so. In recent years, advances in our understanding of the genome and the organization of genes and teas have allowed maize genetics to synthesize more than 50 years of research into a model that explains how a complex genome is regulated by balancing repetitive element, silencing with essential transcriptional program in a dynamic, environmentally responsive manner. DNA methylation and histone modification are examples of epigenetic alteration in plants. Non-coding RNA activity has also been found to function in translation and transcription regulations. Many biological processes in plants are regulated by epigenetic modifications, including transgene and transposon silencing, imprinting regulation, and development. The molecular mechanism of epigenetic modification and epigenetic mark transgenerational inheritance in plants are discussed.
We must all take into account the future of our world. Everyone's well-being must be considered while making decisions for the future of our planet. In order to define this century, achieving ecological balance must be a key priority for everyone, everywhere. A green recovery and natural investment are essential to prevent future pandemics and prepare for current environmental dangers such as climate change and biodiversity loss. Reduce the amount of waste you produce. The 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. You should always be regarded. Volunteer. Participate in neighborhood cleanups. Involvement may also help safeguard your watershed. Water conservation is of paramount importance. Water pollution in the oceans may be reduced over time by increasing water conservation. Commit to protecting the environment. Energy conservation is a top goal. See what happens when you sow a seed. As a source of food and oxygen, trees are vital. Cleaner air and less energy use are only a few of the benefits of these gadgets. Educate. You may help people educate about the need to conserve our natural resources by learning more about them yourself. Help educate and influence others to do their part in saving our world. Things in our environment tend to build on one another. The 21st century's defining issues is making peace with nature, and it should be everyone's top concern. Natural resources must be invested in and prioritized for a green recovery to prevent future pandemics and prepare for present environmental threats like climate change.